Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many people here today for the latest installment of our Critical Issues Confronting China series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Wu. I'm the director of the Fairbanks Center. And this week, we're here to discuss China's demographic challenge. And I think this is one that's well known to many of you. And I see that's why so many of you are out here today. It is, of course, a challenge that is common to societies across East Asia. China is not the only society facing a slowing demographic, but it is also one that in the Chinese context is one that has been affected by a series of Chinese governmental policies. And in particular, I'm speaking about the one-child policy, which had such a large impact on China's demographics and continues to ripple through today. But it's, of course, also affected by other policies, including China's housing policies, China's social welfare policies, education policies, and also its hukou policies, as we think about all of the factors that tie in to the demographic issues confronting China today. And I'm delighted to say we have one of the leading experts to help us understand all of the complexities on this. Professor Feng Wang is a professor of sociology at the University of California at Irvine. His expertise is not only on China's demographics, but also the trends in global demographic change, on social inequality, on public policy, and comparative studies when it comes to population and social history. He is a 2024 Guggenheim Fellow. He's the author of several award-winning books, including his latest one, China's Age of Abundance, Origins, Ascendance, and Aftermath, which looks at the underlying forces driving China's 4-decade-long historical transformation within its society and, of course, in its demographics. Between 2010 and 2013, Professor Wang was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he also directed the Brookings Tsinghua Center for Public Policy in Beijing. We're also honored to have as our discussant today Professor Xiang Zhou, who I think is well known to many of you. He's a professor of sociology here at Harvard, and he's certainly one of our faculty members that we hold in high esteem here at the Fairbanks Center. But his affiliations run widely here at Harvard. In addition to the Fairbanks Center, he's also affiliated with the Weatherhead Center for International Studies, the Harvard Institute for Quantitative Social Sciences, and the Harvard Center for Population Development Studies. And his research broadly concerns economic inequality, mobility, contemporary Chinese society, as well as quantitative methods. So thank you both for being here with us, and please join me in extending a warm welcome to both Professor Wang and Professor Zhou.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming here for this event. I was just apologizing to Professor Xiang Zhou. I did not know there was going to be discussion. I didn't send him anything, but he will. There's so much to talk about, so he will be able to say wonderful things about the topic, not me. I want to begin by thanking Dinda for giving me this topic. Actually, when I was approached to give a talk here, I first, of course, proposed the book that, how does this work? I think, yeah. Is there a pointer? Oh, this thing. Yeah. Which came out. Professor Wu just introduced. Thank you for that kind introduction. And but Dinda gave me the topic, says, well, talk about demographics. And so the topic actually is given by Dinda, but I take, of course, the full responsibilities for the content. So I want to first provide a few background pieces of information on the which underlines what we're going to focus to talk about, which is China's population, of the what we call the miraculous decades, I think many of the older people in this room saw how China in the last 40 years went from a land of material scarcity to material abundance. And it began with food. Just look at how until the beginning of the reform era in the late 1970s, the per capita consumption of basic food hardly improved in the previous 2 or 3 decades. In fact, the per capita consumption measured by kcal was not much better than when the first large-scale survey was done in China in the 1930s. Okay, the only difference was under socialism there was a much more equal distribution, so large-scale starvation was avoided with the exception of the Great Leap Forward. So, so we're looking at how, just in a matter of 5 years, the per capita consumption of basic diet items improved drastically. And what happened is not just Chinese people are not eating more. This has health consequences. But they are also eating new, right? Things like dairy products, right? Chinese population is 90% lactose intolerant. Now it's the largest global importer of dairy products. And then look at the pace of change. In 5 years, this is the milk production just increased by such a huge extent. And then coffee was not part of a tea drinking country population. Now China has the largest number of, well, of course China has larger population of coffee houses, not only just number 2 in terms of Starbucks, but also its local brands. There are more Ruixing coffee shops in China now than Starbucks in the United States, right? So if I ask you, what is this solid line, and it's one of the consumption items, and some of you may be able to just guess without even looking at the legends, right? That's alcohol. Oops. Yeah. So this is the alcohol consumption, right? And then following the rapid increase in other types. The best measure of improvement in diet in the standard of living is the height, the average height of the population. And I just want to focus on this last comparison. In 2 decades, from 1992 to 2012, the average height of a rural girl increased by almost 8 centimeters. Okay, how do we appreciate that? At the fastest growing height increase period in history in European and countries and in Japan, the per decade increase is about 2 centimeters. So here we're looking at 4 centimeters. What's important is also look at how rapid increase for rural females in comparison to other groups, especially to urban groups. So the rural girls increase their height at the largest magnitude, and that has, of course, many reasons, including the overall improvement in diet, in standard of living, but also other issues that we won't have time to discuss in terms of the smaller family size and so on and so forth. So for people who travel to do work in China, I think 20 years ago, without asking a person's origin, you basically can tell. I mean, there's a huge height difference between North and South China, but in a particular region, you look at a person from rural areas, it's shorter, it's weaker, and then you will not be able to see that kind of difference today just by physical difference, right? The migrant labor, young migrants who are delivering packages and food, they look as strong, as tall as their urban counterparts. So that's, and also when you look at rural girls of rural origin, right? So this is really one of the best measures of a spectacular increase in the standard of living in the country. And then with we can go on, because the time constraint, I won't continue with the other measures, from things to eat, clothing, shoes to wear, and to housing facilities. And back in 1985, 1 in 6 urban household owned their apartments or property, and now it's at least 75%. China has one of the highest housing ownership as the country in the whole world. And I took this photo 20 years ago in Jiangsu. Just see how, this is how the old house was. And then when they had little money, they built more. And then they had more money, they built a new house. So, or in the same piece of land. And I won't ask you who lives in which unit. I think you can probably guess. So in other words, in the last 4 decades, we've seen one of the most spectacular economic and social miracles in world history. And it's significant because of the size of the Chinese population and how many people on Earth have changed their lives in terms of what they can eat and where and so on and so forth. And so how unique is China? So when we look at how the standard of living measures from food, from diet, this measure is using the vegetable oil consumption. Look at how this increased. And to housing, the appliances in the household, and then to automobiles, and to overseas trips. So the Chinese people followed the steps of increasing standard of living the same way that people in other societies would follow. Right? You start with food, and then you not quite end with travels to other countries. Okay, so generally we have these 4 common narratives about how to make sense of this economic miracle. And many books have been written, and more, I think, will be written. So that's why here, this is actually an elephant. And you have this blind man touching the elephant, right? So every author, including myself, is one of these small people around this huge elephant. Coming to demographics, we have, these are the 4 common narratives, and I would focus on these 2 because they are mostly closely related to the population, right? The first one is to say that the Chinese economic miracle is unique. It's different from others in the world. We hear about this narrative all the time. Everything China does is unique, right? The second is, of course, the growth is based on what's called the cheap labor. So I won't have time to go to the others. Those are in the book, but I'll focus on the first 2. Okay, now, how is China different or similar from other countries that have had rapid increase in standard of living? So this is a measure of urban population, measured as resident population. That's by not with or classified as urban, not by hukou. So we saw this drastic increase in urbanization in the last 3 decades or so. And along with the rapid increase in urbanization, we also saw a 11.5-fold in per capita income. This is measured in constant US dollars, not affected by inflation. So how why these two happened at the same time? And what's the role of the population behind this, right? So let's look at other countries, China's neighbors. So this is South Korea, urbanization earlier from 30 to 80%. And you saw the increase in per capita income at a larger magnitude than what we saw in China. And then you look at China's other neighbor, which is Japan. And Japan underwent a rapid period of urbanization, and then at the same time, a rapid increase in per capita income. So there are many ways to look at China. One way to look at this with rapid economic growth is fundamentally a massive transformation of the labor from a low productivity farming sector, where 80% of the Chinese population resided on the eve of the economic takeoff, to now about 20% or 30%. So in that sense, think about this, okay, so for a farmer, the hourly wage divided by the annual yield is negligible. You can't even talk about hourly income for a farmer. That's really impossible to calculate. But when that person goes into city as a construction worker, as an assembly line worker, or even working in a restaurant, the hourly increase in income is multifold, right? So that is what has happened in China, earlier in South Korea, and earlier in Japan. So in that sense, if you look at the bottom of these changes, what China has gone through is no different from other countries. I mean, we can think of Taiwan and other a slower process in other industrialized countries. So now we are turning more to the demographics. China enjoyed a substantial demographic dividend. Okay, I want to make a clarification here that the term of demographic dividend is not just when you have this kind of support ratio, where the support ratio is the lowest around, declining as China began economic takeoff. So you have a declining share of young people, and yet at the same time, a very small share of elderly people. But the demographic dividend is not an automatic reflection of the population age structure. So here, without going into details, it's a calculation, what is called the economic support ratio, where basically you take the population age structure, but also looking at the productivity of the population. And then there we see a rapid increase in the economic support ratio. This is a combination of demography and of productivity. And roughly by year 2015, around that time, before this, the economic support ratio is positive. Actually, this number, without going into the technical details, it's the contribution to the per capita economic growth rate. So in other words, here we're looking at about 1% to anywhere to 2% of growth of the economy was due to this favorable demographic dividend. And Andrew Mason at University of Hawaii and myself, we did a early study on this, and I think other studies have shown this as well. So somewhere about 15% of China's economic growth in the last 2 decades of the 20th century could be attributed to this demographic dividend. I think the message here, again, is that dividend has disappeared. Okay. So as I just said earlier, the demographic dividend is not just the population age structure. You can have a lot of young people, and you don't have the dividend. So that goes to the second question, that is how the Chinese economic boom was driven by this, what's called the cheap labor. What I think we need to pay attention to, looking at history, is that China did not just have cheap labor. China had good labor. Okay? And it was good labor that's made cheap by the household registration, the migration, the control policy. So here, these dots are all the countries in 1976 in the world from the World Bank data set. And it's the relationship between income in log form and child mortality under age 5. So the pattern is the higher the income, the lower the mortality rate. So mortality rate under age 5 is perhaps the best measure of population health. Okay? And so this is the pattern regression line of all the countries at that time. And here's China, right? So if we draw this horizontally to here, so China had in 1976 a mortality level that's at an income level that would be suggested by middle and high income country at the time. Okay, so in other words, when you look at the Chinese the per capita income back in 1976, $200 per year, it was a low income country, right, for sure. But if you look at the mortality, child mortality level, the health level, and it's outlier, it's way below what was suggested by the income level. Okay, I won't have time to go into why this was the case. I think for people who are familiar with the Chinese history, know that this is not due to nutrition. It's mostly public health. China also had a literate population. Now, the measure here used is the enrollment of middle school of female enrollment, middle school. And again, this is income level. And you have a line here of the countries back in 1976 that higher the income level, per capita income level, the higher enrollment. And again, look at how outlier China was with such a low income level, but a education level, if you draw this to this line, and would be comparable to a middle or upper middle income country. Okay, so in other words, on the eve of China's economic takeoff, China not only had a large population, a population that's predominantly rural, but also a population that's healthier and more educated than what the income level would suggest. So this is very important. And when migrants came to cities to work on the construction site, or even to take a train, take a bus, that basic literacy is very important, right? And so what we see is that, again, to look at this argument that China had cheap labor, the labor was not just cheap. It was good labor. It's a labor that's also, I mean, for people who know China, I think everybody here has the familiarity. They work really hard. Chinese people work really hard. So, however, I think in the last 30 years, the Chinese demographic landscape has fundamentally changed, not just in terms of numbers, old or young, right? Some of you may come here to expect that kind of discussion. I will talk about this, but mainly look at the characteristics of the population, right? So the Chinese census in 1990 gave us the share of the population that's still working in the agriculture sector, right? So 70% or more. And this is what is now with the latest census. So among the young people, it's no more than 10%, right? So overall, we're looking at a flip. That is 70%, about 80% or 75 to 80% of the labor force now are working in non-farming sectors. So that's why I think this idea of China can rely on further urbanization to drive its economic growth. Recall the comparisons early on. That's not going to happen again because this is the history. And now we turn into demographic future for China. I think the sentence we want to remember is that even for someone like me, the pace of change is unexpectedly fast, right? I'll give you one example. This is the United Nations projection of China's population, and this was done in 2019, and then this is their new estimation of China's population. So instead of having 1 billion at the end of the century, the UN's, was this the latest? I think they probably have a new one. The 2022 projection shows that China would have about half of its population right now, okay? And the share of China's population as world total was about 10% with the earlier projection, and now UN projects it's only 7.5%. By the end of the century, it's 7 decades, 7.5. And looking into the future, UN, this is the latest projection. UN projects the fertility rate now, it's about 1.2 birth per couple, and they expect this to go up by 1.5. I think we can have a discussion whether this is going to happen or not. And this is what has happened after the end of the one-child policy with fertility, right? So I think the essence here is we have underestimated, including myself, how demographic change, fertility decline, aging would be, and we still don't know what's coming up. Okay. Now, I think this would get into more of the demography sphere, and this is, we're talking about why fertility is low. One of the reasons people are not getting married, I think we read a lot of the numbers here, and this is the share of women who were never married by late 20s, early 30s, and look at how this has gone up from 5% less than to about over 1/3. This is the latest census, 2020, right? And then the change, especially rapid, was from 2000 to 2010. And this is where, I think I'll go next, is when the most rapid urbanization process took place. Okay. So these are some of the forces that are really driving the postponement in marriage or even not getting married. First, this would have implications we already saw the urbanization process, right? And we already saw the transformation from rural to farming to non-farming. But this is something that, a factor that's very, very important and also has a lot of implications for when we look at China ahead. And this is the college, I think, the annual enrollment in colleges. And I think in about 10 years, from the late 1990s to the beginning of 2000, the annual enrollment in colleges, tertiary institutions, increased 6-fold, right? From about 1 million to 6 million. And now, China has annual capacity of enrolling about 10 million people into colleges. and China had fewer than 10 million births in the last couple of years. So in other words, every Chinese birth in the future should have a spot in a tertiary educational institution. Well, I don't need to work out with you on how increased education, college education, would have an effect on employment, on values, and on marriage, right? So what we're seeing in late marriage is only, I think it's only the beginning if you compare China to South Korea to Japan, especially to Taiwan. Taiwan is the champion of late marriage, right? I think it's something like 80% of the late young women in the late 20s were still single, never married, right? In Japan, here's the thing. In Japan, about a third, 1 in 3 among women, and then among men, it's 1 in 4. No, 40%. 2 in 5 were still single, never married, in the late 2010s in Japan, which means that a third, or to more than a third of Japanese young people would not have children. So, and China is, by looking at these numbers, is moving in that direction as well, right? So low fertility has a number of reasons. One of them is marriage. And then we have some evidence to show this. This, again, I think it's from the 2020 census, yeah. And this is the share of women unmarried by educational attainment, and this is for college and the plus, right? So look at every age group is the more educated. And that is the opposite here for men. The unmarried is the highest, in late 30s. These are men who would never get married. I think this is the story about the surplus man, right? The poor man who would not find a wife. Okay, looking ahead, here I would like to share with you a number of implications of demographic changes, not just on low birth rate, fast aging, but the demographics that are have more economic and social implications. The first is China's unfinished urbanization. So just a while ago, I talked about how the urbanization seemed to have finished, that there's no more large untapped surplus labor in the countryside to come into the cities. But China faces this historical legacy, which is China, what I call, has 3 urbanizations, not just one. The middle one is the one we saw earlier, is the residential population by government statistics. Now I think it's over 65%. And the top one is what I call the economic urbanization, which is the share of population that's in non-farming, right? So if you look at this, you don't actually, the urbanization level implied by labor force type of activities, you don't have that many people left. However, I think the largest challenge is the difference between the last two. The bottom line is the share of the population with a local household registration, right, with the hukou in the place of residence. And that's under 50%. The difference between these two, it's at 2020 is 260 million people. Okay, so that is 18%, right? Over 18%. And then the majority of these migrants who do not have a local hukou are in places with 5 million or more. So China has been undergoing a serious reforms in household registration system. And right now, the barrier is still for cities over 5 million or more. It's harder to get in. It's for smaller cities, you can actually have your household registration changed relatively easily. Now, some large cities now are opening up, but the largest ones, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, okay, are still having the most restrictive household policies for giving migrant population hukou. So the policies are getting looser, but the large share of these migrants are still in large cities. So here, this is why this is so difficult. Okay, 50% of Chinese government revenue come from local governments. So 50% central government, 50% local governments. Spending, 90% local. So if Shanghai wants to open up to more migrants, the Shanghai government needs to put up with the funds for healthcare and for schooling, for everything else. And that is why, and we all hear about debt crisis, local government debt. So that is why, even with the cost for more household registration system reforms, it's not going to be easy because it is a monetary issue, and then the local governments would have to pay for the expenses. Okay. So in other words, China faces an unfinished urbanization, mostly because of the legacy of the hukou system. I've showed you at the beginning of this talk the tremendous improvement in standard of living in the last 30, 40 years. And that's not only seen in child and in the height of girls, but also for the elderly population. Look at what happened in the last 40 years. The number of years that an elderly person age 60 is expected to live. It was, right, so I think this is what, over, about 10 years of increase at age 60, right? So that's a tremendous blessing and good news. People live for so long now, even at old age. However, that also has implication for healthcare. That is, if you look at the cost of death change from 1990 to 2020, it moved, the cost of death, the composition in China, moved from about 40% of the non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases, from 40% to 70%. So this composition is very similar to what we see in advanced industrialized countries, which has tremendous implications because these are not diseases that you can get rid of with simple immunization, low-cost immunization, right? And they are or by antibiotics. And so these would have long-term and very expensive costs associated with the healthcare as China moves forward. So we see both the very good news, that is the improvement in population health at all ages, and also a new disease profile, which requires a different healthcare setup and also expenditure. And again, I want to come back to this question of urban-rural divide. And 70% of the population now are classified as urban. But we're still seeing, this is from the 2020 census, two worlds when it comes to old age support. The urban population, the majority of them could, let me see which one is, right, this is urban population. The orange share is the ones reported relying on pension as the main source of income, and that's the part for the rural population. In the Lianghui, just finished not too long ago, this month, some delegates called for increasing the level of pension for the rural population, rural elderly. Remember, overall, China has 30% of the population still classified as rural, but among elderly population, the share is much higher. Okay, and I think the ratio between urban and the rural pension, something is like 20, 30 times, right? So there are calls to increase spending for rural population elderly support, also as a way to stimulate consumption, to alleviate the pressure on the migrants, on their children. It's a very good idea, but again, bear in mind of the overall fiscal pressure the government faces, which I will turn to. My colleagues, Cai Yong and Shen Ke, we did some analysis showing what share of the GDP would have to be used for the three social welfare programs: education, healthcare, and pension. Okay, there are two scenarios. One is without any change in the benefit level. That is, we're not going to increase the rural elderly's pension. And the other one is with the assumption that China would gradually moving toward a level that's comparable to its income, so would be a level that we've seen in OECD countries 20 years ago, the general what we call the generosity level. So this is what we see. Without any change in benefit generosity, the share of GDP that has to be spent on these social programs would reach 20% by about 2040. That's 15 years from now. What does that mean? This line is the share of the GDP. Actually, yeah. Well, that's the government revenue as the share of GDP. So in other words, the government revenue is about 25% of GDP, right? And without increase in benefit level, just population aging alone would drive the expenditure up to the level that's going to take all the government revenue at this current level. And should we have some increase in benefit generosity level, and that date would come much earlier. So imagine China would have to spend all its government revenue on these three social programs. Aging is an important factor, but health care expenditure is driven largely by an older population as well. So the good news is that taxation level in China overall, it's not too high. So the share of government revenue as GDP is still relatively low. So China still has room to increase taxes, and so to meet this challenge, the bad news is that collecting tax is not easy, right? China is still the paradise for capitalists, right? Even this day, no property tax, very little, no inheritance tax, right? And we don't know how the government under Xi Jinping would go after the Chinese families to collect more property tax. The experiment has been going on for more than 2 decades, right? So it's not easy. And then the other hard fact is that the high growth and high revenue period for China is over. So this is the GDP growth rate in the last couple of decades, right? It went from 10 now to 6, and last year was 5%. And look at the government revenue. So when the GDP was growing at 10% per year, government revenue was growing at 20% on average. So that's when China had money to build airports, railroads, universities, hospitals, and also invested in education. But that golden era has ended. Right now, I think 2019, that's before pandemic, the government revenue increase was only 4%. I think we just heard from last month. Last year, taxes and government revenue are under continued pressure. So, so this all add together, I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge largely driven by the population, both in terms of urbanization and also population aging. So here, I think we come quickly to the end. So what happens afterwards, after this fast growth? There are gravitational forces for slow growth after rapid growth, declining return to capital investment, and expenditure in social benefits, right? So these are forces that are present in all other societies, and China cannot be said to have the ability to escape these slow growth forces, right? And we look at Japan and South Korea. So after the rapid growth period ended for Japan, and its growth rate is, on average, is less than 1.5%, right? South Korea is doing better, but it's no more than 3%. So for China, actually, to sustain the 5%, it's quite a impressive goal, right? And so all these have implications for how China would be able to fund its aging population in the years to come. So I want to skip these two. Okay, now come to the last, the summary, okay. I want to highlight two observations here. One is that the so-called demographic problem, low fertility, not getting married, aging, these problems do not have demographic solutions. Okay. What I mean by this is that we've seen reports, efforts by government to increase spending, to give subsidies, and to make childcare easier. In almost no place this has ever worked, right? So by solving the demographic problem, aging, through stimulating birth is not the way to go, okay? And because it's not worked. Okay, I was in South Korea 2016, attended a conference where they announced their third five-year plan to raise birth rate. They said that was their last chance. South Korea has spent $20 billion so far on this, and the fertility has been going down, except with a small uptick last year. It's the lowest in the world. And 40 years ago, China attempted to solve the population problem, which was growth, through a demographic solution featured by the one-child policy. China's demographic problem at that time, growth, was not solved by making people having fewer births, even to only one per household. The demographic problem was solved through its economic growth, through social, political, and economic reforms. So the surplus population, the growing population, had this great opportunity to change their lives, right? So, so that's one thing I think I want to emphasize. And then the other one is that there is still this elephant in the room I have not talked about since time is up, which is China with its 3.5 decades one-child policy, produced over 100 million families, more than 1 in 3, with only one child. And then the full consequences of the one-child policy are only beginning to unfold. So we saw the tremendous costs paid during the enforcement of the policy, but to what extent these only children would face when their parents get really old, not just in the 60s, 70s, but 80s and 90s, and what kind of society China would be at that time is a question that we will all be looking for answers, right? And I think with that, I should end this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wang, for this really fascinating talk. First of all, I would like to admit that I don't really have a discussion prepared. I believe there was some miscommunication between Dinda and me. I thought my job was to moderate the Q&A.
That's what I thought too.
But I do want to take this chance to ask Professor Wang a couple of questions that I really would like to hear more thoughts about. So you mentioned that I really like your talk. You organized your talk around the four narratives, like you kind of debunking the myth one by one, and you really highlighted the two immense demographic challenges facing China. One is declining fertility, which is a huge demographic problem. You are saying there's no demographic solution to, and the other immense challenge is fiscal pressures, especially for elderly care and health care. So yeah, I think there are some scholars proposing a different kind of demographic solution, which is immigration. As you might know, Professor Liang Jianzhang and some other professors have proposed selective immigration, especially skilled labor, as a potential solution to address China's labor shortages. I'm just curious whether you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very natural to go into these demographic solutions, including immigration. There's a saying among some immigration scholars, or no, politicians actually, which is all we wanted is labor, and then the people came. Okay, so we see that in this country, we see that in Europe, and China being well, China has a long history of having many minority populations, which are kind of treated as foreign, but being a highly homogeneous culturally, politically society, and increasingly nationalistic country, and then such a large population, I think the challenge associated with immigration is probably going to be even greater. Mm-hmm. So for a smaller country, you can, there will be substantial, immigration could play a noticeable role. You go to Japan now, you see most service workers are actually from China or from Southeast Asia, increasingly, yeah. Mm-hmm. But for China, I think there are many challenges because it's so large and then it's so nationalistic. Mm-hmm. I won't say ethnocentric, but it is. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. I think this is really a distinguishing feature. If we compare China with South Korea, with Japan, with even Taiwan, you have shown a lot of similarities in the historical trajectories, right? The rise of GDP per capita following urbanization, industrialization, and they're also ahead of us, in terms of demographic challenges. So there should be some lessons we might be able to learn from, and we have seen that all of these societies have experimented with immigration as a potential solution to fertility challenges. in terms of government spend and fiscal pressure for elderly care and for healthcare, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about the best kind of a policy solutions or kind of measures to raise tax revenues, like property taxes, or if you look at China's pension system, it's also pretty like fragmented. If you look at the U.S., we have like a multi-layered pension system. There's a 401k, there's a IRA, very privatized, right? A lot of investments in the stock markets. But the China's system seems to be more primitive. So do you think China should emulate, say, the U.S. in reforming this kind of the pension system to just enhance social welfare, especially for the elderly?
I think that's another. It's a great area, and again, I think the issue, the challenges here are deeply political, and because I'm not in any position to make suggestions for the government, but it seems to be a no-brainer for China to have a nationwide social security system, like most other high-income societies have, like the United States has a social security system that's nationwide, so that would not. What first would be more equalized, and secondly would allow people to move around more easily. But that idea, I think, is deeply challenging for I would say, Chinese policymakers because, largely because of the slowing down in the economic growth, and then the government revenue issue, right? China had the opportunity earlier, a decade and a half ago, when they would, when the revenue was growing at 20% per year, to do more. I mean, China did a lot, implemented compulsory education, ended agriculture taxes, and also began what we saw now, a modest elderly pension system in rural areas, but that's far from enough.
Right.
But right now, you cannot lower the level of the people who are receiving high pensions, but if you increase the people at the bottom, where does the money come from, right? So, I mean, they could, again, this is going too detailed. They could, for instance, consider like what you just said, a two-tier system. That is to allow those with higher pension to keep a segment of that as their old promised benefit, but to take part of that, to move that into a nationwide social security scheme, right? So that should be the first thing that China should do, and I don't know whether that's actually not even discussed that much.
Right.
In my mind.
Yeah, the basic social security system.
Right. That's no-brainer for a country, right?
Yeah,
they can't. I mean, if they were going to really integrate the population, like we talk about urban-rural divide, and the first thing to do is to have a nationwide, a social security system just provide a bottom. Right. But that's hard. That's very challenging. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Since we don't have a lot of time left, I think we should, open the floor for questions. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Wang. Andrew Erickson, visiting scholar at the Fairbanks Center, professor at the Naval War College. If I understood you correctly, you said in describing one of the earlier slides that even if generosity of benefits were held neutral, by some year it would come to consume the entirety of the amount of current government spending. What year was that? Have you written further on this? I find this extremely important, and I'd love to understand the calculations better.
Of course. send me email. It was published in a journal called Population Development Review. I sent you the article. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for your talk. My name is Si Wu. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Boston University. So I have two questions. The first one is on your comment on how China's economic boom was driven by the cheap labor. I'm very interested in whether you have thought about the gender aspect to this question, like throughout the economic reform, perhaps women take certain sector of the jobs, whereas men take the others. And as most people know, China's one-child policy is actually one of the most gender policies enacted in the history of the country because it created a whole generation of singleton girls. So I'm wondering if you can, your perspective on this. And my second question is, you commented on the two worlds of old age support between the urban and rural population. I'm wondering, because of the current ongoing hukou reform, if you have thought about whether the long-term impact of that reform on the rural and urban population in terms of the old age support. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Excuse me. I think for the first one, on the gendered dimension of this economic miracle, it's very much there. And Chinese women always have had among the highest labor force participation rate, not defined by formal employment, but in terms of working. And when you look at the migration, it comes from both ends. One is the supply of the leaving of Chinese girls. And what happened was earlier in the 90s, when migration started to accelerate, the girls were among the first to leave. The very early stage where men went out for construction. But soon after service and factory out and assembly lines opened them up, girls went out because they left school early and they would now do farming. So that's from the supply side. And then from the demand side, I wrote this in the book, and others have written about this in the factories, that many jobs that they actually preferred girls, young women, for not just economic reasons, but social reasons as well. They were easy to discipline, so on and so forth. So that's the part from the countryside. And then you look at urban areas, indeed, the one-child policy created a lot of these only girl families. And the girls actually benefited more compared with when they have siblings in terms of their parental investment and in terms of their status in the society. I think that in part explains, combined with this higher educational expansion, explains why you have this sharp increase in postponement in marriage. So clearly, I think there's a tremendous gender story behind this great economic boom. In terms of household registration reforms, I think, as I referred to early on, it's not just a matter of giving people hukou, right? It's complicated because what's important is not that piece of paper, it's the benefits that come with this. Now, in terms of education, I think migrant families, their children can receive education, but not in higher education, not college entrance exams, right? And then in terms of pension, the difference in the pension between Shanghai and Kaifeng and a smaller city, Anqing in Anhui province, for instance, is enormous. Even they're all urban, right? So again, the challenge is where the money comes from. Right? It's the Chinese fiscal arrangement, that system.
Tom Palmer, a former journalist. UC Irvine is a gorgeous campus, I just want to say. My question is very basic. How is a level of a family's pension determined? And is the lowest level equal to a subsistence existence?
So the question was about the pension level? Yeah, well, excuse me. Again, I think it's basically where you are. I think for most people who were associated with, okay, there are three categories, I would say. There are retirees, and there are urban people without like some kind of formal employment. They didn't have pension. And then you have, like I said, people in the countryside. So roughly the three categories. And so the first set, the people who actually had employment, their pension is, in general, more than sufficient. And then the second part is, the urban unemployed, I mean, not formally employed people, if their income level is low, they get some subsidies. The level is higher than the countryside, much higher, but not very high. So it would be a struggle for them. But many of them actually were not in the system for a reason, which is some of them were in private business and so on and so forth. So they have private wealth accumulated, not everybody. So there are some urban poor as well. And I've gone back to China a couple of times, and with economic softening and people not spending money, you hear that the urban retirees are the most envied group. Okay, let me give you one number. I think a professor retired from Fudan University could get to up to 20,000 RMB per month. That's $3,000. That's very high. Yeah. But not everybody. So depending where you are, what your former jobs are. But for a lot of people who were in the system, the formal sector, they are the best supported group.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Wang. My name is Xiang Zhou. I'm a first-year student at the Regional Studies East Asia program here at Harvard. So my question is related to how exactly can we boost China's birth rate. It would be very tempting to say that we're only the subsidizing programs do not work because they're really moderate in size. But it seems like you're arguing that even if we impose a much more radical program than what we have right now, it will still not help the birth rate as much because as we've seen in South Korea and Japan, it will not work. So I guess my question is, what exactly can we do to rejuvenate our birth rate? Of course, that is given China still needs human beings in the future.
Okay, it's a question that we ask all the time. Let me give you one as a starter, which is we noticed that childbearing and rearing, just by history and by design of the culture, the burden falls disproportionately on women, mother, because for one factor that the man cannot carry a pregnancy, right? So so what about let's make women's life easier? So as a starter, but I'm joking with you. Actually, that's another starter to change the gender structure of any society. Especially look at China. It's 24 members of the Politburo, of the most powerful body of the Communist Party. There's not a single woman. So let's try to change that gender structure in that country. And so I think that tells you how hard this would be. No, I'm not saying it's hopeless. I'm not saying that in the absence of this, we shouldn't do other things to make people's life easier. Child care, right? urban people, the thing is, I live in Irvine, not far from Los Angeles, but Los Angeles or big cities, everywhere in the world, that's where the jobs are. And how could you have childcare in a big city when people commute often, work, right? Do you take your kids to work? And then for the Chinese cases, can you, in big cities where housing price is so high, can you bring your parents? Most of them can't. So think about, it's just, it's raising a child is just, there are all sorts of costs. So childcare, for instance, is one of the starting points as well, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. My name is Huiying You. I am a business consultant. Most of my clients are manufacturing area. So I have a very practical question because one of their challenges now they are facing is labor. The skilled labor, like age from 35 to 45, they are leaving. They just come back to their hometown, but they have so many intelligence produce line 智能生产线, and they want to attract young people to work with them. But the old image, the factory old image, and the lower salaries cannot attract them. So my clients, they are working so hard to want to change this situation. What's your opinion or suggestions to them from strategically?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for raising that question. Actually, I made a important omission in my talk earlier. It seemed to be all bad news, but it's not all bad news because China has, I think actually at the last slide, China has the healthiest and most educated population in its history, right? And I don't want to go to this automatic answer to say, technology, AI, but the educated young Chinese population it can be much more productive. I was in the Kunshan Industrial Park a year and a half ago. Was very impressed by seeing how many companies were producing all sorts of robots there. And I saw in one huge warehouse, the factory produces robots for shelving. And it was just I even have photos. Just like two persons, but they have to be able to use computer to control the robots and then to monitor. And previously, the warehouse would require 24 people just pushing the cars to shelving. And now with robots and with these highly educated workers, two persons can do a 24-person job. So China has turned into the manufacturing center of the world. And I think in terms of like robots and stuff like that, they can drastically help to increase the productivity. So that is, the good news. And also Chinese, the elderly population, the retirement age was awfully early, 55 for women, 60 for men, and now they finally started to increase the retirement age gradually, which is a sensible thing to do because if you look at the health level, a person age 60 now can live 10 more years than 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So there are specific, I think, bright spots, potential for these demands. But still, I think when it comes to taking parents to the hospital, when the parents expect to have certain emotional and social interaction with their children, and I doubt robots would be able to, AI would be able to replace those. So there are, challenges, but there are bright spots which I neglect to talk about. Yeah.
Would you also suggest hiring more older people in addition to robots?
Yeah,
the
right.
labor shortage?
So absolutely, yeah. I think there's a long way to go, yeah.
Hi, Professor Wang. Thank you for the talk. My name is Richard Zhang. I'm the founder of a PE fund, and I'm also a doctorate student from United Business Institute. My question is, from listening to the lecture, it seems to me that there's a psychological issue towards the new generation. So their unwillingness to participate.
For example, like in some top cities, even like in Shanghai, a lot younger generation, they inherit quite a lot of wealth. So the problem is not about the wealth. It's not about the social benefits. They've already got a lot. For example, like 2 families and only 1 grandchildren. So they inherit quite a lot of houses from their parents and grandparents. Of course, on one hand, they're facing future supporting issues with all of those parents and grandparents due to the longer life expectancy. On the other hand, the current issue, a more serious one, is those younger generation, they're not willing to go out to work, to participate. They prefer to stay home. And also, given the fact actually there's not so many employment opportunities outside. So they don't mind staying at home doing nothing. So that might be a very serious issue. So how do you address that, and what's your perspective?
Great question. I would say luck, because let me explain why. In the last 40 years, especially I think in the last 30 years, last 20 years, since 2000, there's so much household wealth generated, you're right. And with this particular demographic setup, that is, you have 2 urban families with each with only 1 child, and they would inherit property, wealth from both sides of the parents. But as someone who lives in this country and is seeing how elderly parents can live for how long and how costly the long-term care, the household care could be. So not every household, even with household, well, first of all, not every household has the kind of wealth, but even for those with household wealth, the lucky scenario of longevity of the parents can actually exhaust a lot of this wealth. So that's what I mean, it's by luck, because some families, they would not run into this need for long-term care for their parents. It's still at the beginning. And others, this would go on for years, decades, and then cost, even in China now, to hire a in-house aide for like in big cities, and it costs way over $1,000 to $1,500 per month. So imagine if you have 2 bedridden parents, and even with wealth, they could run out. So in a way, I think it's luck. But overall, I think the current generation is still lucky because of the wealth that's created in this one generation. We saw this in Korea, in Japan. They all started to send their children overseas, and that has stopped because the parents now, they don't have the extra wealth, right? So I think on the one hand, the wealth that's accumulated could buffer a lot of this elderly support need. But on the other hand, I would say still many families could be left out because of this thing I call luck.
Right. Yeah, we are running out of time, so we don't have time to accommodate more questions. Thank you very much, Professor Wang, for the brilliant talk and for the very thoughtful responses to questions. Hopefully, we'll have, chance to reconnect in the near future.
Thank you.
These are the 7 most powerful men in China. They represent the top leadership positions of the ruling party, and their identities are revealed every 5 years at a carefully choreographed political event called the National Congress.
China's Communist Party unveils its new leadership over the next 5 years.
The order of appearance is symbolic. The first person to emerge is the head of the party for the next 5 years. At the most recent event in October 2022, that person was Xi Jinping, China's president for the last 10 years, who walked out in the top spot a historic third time after getting rid of China's presidential term limit that restricted all his predecessors to